Hi, welcome to World Civilizations since 1500. Now, this is session 3 of the first topic titled The Many Worlds of the Pre-Modern Era. So far, we have looked at economic systems. We did that quite thoroughly in the first session. In the second session, we were looking at social organization, and we covered quite extensively different civilizations like China, for example, India, the Middle East, parts of Africa, the west central coast of Africa, and also Mesoamerica, in terms of how human societies were organized around kinship or extended family groups like clans and tribes and lineage groups, for instance. At the end of session 2, we offered an introduction to another form of social organization that existed before the modern era, which was known as clientage, otherwise known as feudalism as well. I mean, there are two ways of actually conceptualizing that form of organization. And the way human societies were conformed, for example, in Europe, we're going to be looking at Europe just shortly here, and also in some parts of Africa, is that the way people are coming together is by seeking the protection of some form of strongman due to the fact that their king groups were disintegrated due to wars or droughts and other natural catastrophes. And so we're going to get to see in this session clientage in Europe and Mozambique and Ethiopia. And after we do that, we're going to move into the last part of this topic, which is going to deal with religious worldviews. All right. So let us turn to our outline here. Okay, so let's look at clientage here. So clientage, as I explained, is a system of patron-client relationships. Okay. So that is, again, a kind of contractual relationship between a strong man and people that are coming together to form a society. Okay, so the patron here is the one that protects, offers protection to the people that lives under his domain, and the people go about their daily lives producing what needs to be produced and pay a certain amount of their product to the landlord or the chief or the king, prince, etc., as a form of payment for the protection, as I explained. So let's look at feudalism or clientage systems in Europe, and Europe was perhaps the best case study for how clientage was conformed in the pre-modern era. Those were perhaps regions that were the exception to the norm, because all over the world, as I explained in the second session, human societies were organized around kinship. So clientage becomes the dominant form of social organization in Europe about 450 onwards, all the way to the early modern era and modern period in Europe, about the 15 and even into the 1600s. We're going to see that clientage was the dominant form of social organization. The way this occurred is that in Europe, the Roman Empire, which was really the political system that had conquered great portions of the European continent and governed the European continent through the role of an emperor who imposed order across the realm by using the Roman legions. I mean, they really protected the roads. The Roman soldiers, the Roman army really enforced the law. So it maintained a certain form of stability across Europe down through the centuries. But around 450, the Roman Empire disintegrated for many reasons. There were economic reasons. There were also invasions from nomadic groups from Central Europe, the Germanic tribes. So there was a wide variety of different reasons why the Roman Empire disintegrated. But by 450, it collapsed. So now Europeans, the different European communities, the different provinces that were part of the Roman Empire no longer have the protection of the Roman army to enforce the law and protect them from raids and invasions from the nomadic groups. Virtually all of the peoples that live under the Roman Empire were now without any form of protection, so they require some form of protection. So this is going to lead to clientage. So what we're going to see is that there were very wealthy people that were part of the Roman Empire, very prominent generals as well, that were no longer part of the Roman army, that seized certain regions of the former Roman Empire and started establishing a series of independent kingdoms. So we're going to see that out of one single political entity, which was the Roman Empire, we're going to see that this Roman Empire disintegrated, and we're going to see the emergence of a series of independent kingdoms as, again, powerful people with wealth, with military means, began seizing lands and creating their own independent kingdoms. So Europe now becomes divided in that fashion, and this is going to lead to that clientage system, because ultimately what those independent rulers were doing as they seized territory is that they were offering protection to people that were left without the protection. You know, the roads were very dangerous back then. There was a lot of, robberies. There was a lot of piracy. There was a lot of invasions and raids by nomads, the so-called barbarians, and so on. So life was very difficult and dangerous and uncertain. And so what we see is a contractual kind of relationship between now the new rulers of the independent kingdoms and the population. And so the rulers were offering protection as they started really assembling their own private armies. And so there will be soldiers that were part of the Roman Empire that ended up becoming really the soldiers of those independent kingdoms. They were part of those private armies, and they became so-called the vassals again of those kings, or the knights as they were known. And again, there was a certain contractual obligation between the king and the vassal. Again, the vassal needed to be loyal to their king and serve the king in every possible way, particularly when the king required the vassal or the knight to go to war, for example, and defend the kingdom, for example. So there were oaths of loyalty, again, that were made between the vassal and the king. And in return, the vassal or the knight was awarded a piece of land for him to control and extract tribute from the population. So what we see is the creation of a land-owning elite. Again, a series of landowners, or all of them were knights serving a king, and they were the private soldiers and generals of this king, protecting the king, but in return they were receiving, of course, their own land grants. And what we see is also the creation of fiefdoms. A fiefdom, again, is really a land grant given to a knight for him to control and extract tribute from the population. And the population needed to pay the tribute to both their knight, their landlord, but also to the king as well, who were protecting them. So again, this is again the kind of system that we see emerging in Europe. That's called clientage. So what we see in Europe under feudalism, again, is a series of independent kingdoms. There's kings emerging, of course, in different parts of Europe as well. They're controlling their own domain. They're defending their own domain from other kingdoms, but also from the barbarians by using their vassals or knights who have been awarded land grants, and the peasants and also serfs are paying tribute to their overlords for the protection they receive. Okay, and there are, of course, ceremonies of submission, again, in which you establish that kind of contract. You go and live in a kingdom to receive protection, and in order to live there, to be allowed to live there, you need to actually enter into this covenant, if you will, with your overlords and undergo a ceremony of submission again. So in this relationship, of course, the vassals, for example, must swear allegiance to their kings and provide military service, and in return they receive land grants. Now, the peasants must also be loyal and subservient to their feudal lords and pay the tribute that is required to sustain the kingdom and also the private armies. They must feed also the private armies as well. You know, serfs were people that had no freedom. They were the kind of the European version of a slave in this case, that were paying not only tribute, but they were in many cases without any rights to land, for example, or movement, and they had to serve an individual for life and so on, and like a personal slave and so on again. So this is the kind of system that we see emerging in Europe. It's called clientage. In Africa, we see in two regions something very similar. For example, in Ethiopia for thousands of years was a society based on kinship organization as well. But around the 6th and 7th century AD, Ethiopia was invaded by a new group coming from the Arabian Peninsula. We see the Arab invasion of North Africa and the spread of Islam. We're going to be talking about that in this session later on. And the Muslims pretty much took over the entire region and the trade, and ended up really toppling many of the local political structures of North Africa, including Ethiopia as well. Okay, so with this invasion of Ethiopia, the Arab Muslims take control of the trade, and what we see is the Ethiopian economy collapsing again. And really, again, this invasion also led to the collapse of the Mediterranean economy. Again, there was really a network of commercial links across the Mediterranean that were established, even going back to the ancient Greeks and the Romans. And this network of trade between different city-states also collapsed as a result of this invasion. And that led, of course, to the collapse of the monetary system of Ethiopia. The silver currency was also abolished and destroyed, and the rulers of Ethiopia lost their revenue. So the native rulers of Ethiopia had to move south to flee the invasion. And as they were fleeing the invasion, once again, warfare is really responsible for breaking up the network of familial organization that had existed there. And many people are now fleeing south. And as the rulers flee south, they're going to encounter upon other ethnic groups, people that did not belong to their own ethnic group. And as they move south and as they encounter other societies, they're going to enter into this contractual relationship as well with the other ethnic groups that they encounter, and they're now offering protection again, pretty much installing themselves as the new rulers of other ethnic groups, and they're now extracting tribute from them to protect the population. This is really a new kind of social organization based on clientage. The people that are paying tribute, they're going to pay tribute to an overlord. Again, the Ethiopian rulers install different overlords in the southern region of Ethiopia, and the overlords are just extracting tribute from them. And the idea is that this is a relationship for protecting ourselves, to protect the people from the invasion, in other words. So again, it's very similar, although there's significant differences, to the feudal system of Europe. In Europe, we also see invasions. We see the nomadic invasions, the Germans invading the Roman Empire, and that led to feudalism. And here we see the Arab invasion of Ethiopia, which also led to feudalism as well. Another region of Africa that also entered into this clientage system of social organization was Mozambique. This is in the southern portion of Africa. And here we see also that the situation here was more a crisis of the environment, prolonged droughts in this case. The Sena tribe of Mozambique, which was a tribe that was based on kinship, faced a crisis when there were prolonged droughts that led to famine, for example, and also led to a shortage of labor, because ultimately what that led to is, population decline. So although there was an overabundance of land, there was a shortage of labor. So what, in many cases, the Sena tribe had to do is allow for the members to leave the tribe and search a safe haven or refuge in another group that perhaps was not affected by this catastrophe. And so, in many cases, this led to people searching for a strong man. We talked about that. Again, this is what feudalism is. People are searching for a strong man because their communities are affected either by invasions, warfare, or drought, for example. And the lineages are now giving up members voluntarily to seek refuge, again, in other places in order to receive the sustenance that they need, particularly food. So there were ceremonies that were performed in Mozambique, again, ceremonies of subordination, in which people entered this contractual relationship with an overlord that was not part of their king group. So you will go to another society and you will now meet the chief or the strongman, the local leader of that group that was doing rather well, and you will perform a certain ceremony of submission. In this case, that ceremony became known as breaking the metate. This is breaking a vase or a pot, for example, made from clay. And that was a very symbolic act of saying, I'm giving up myself to you, I'm becoming your servant, and so on, and I will pay tribute to you in terms of providing labor. And that strongman is now in charge of you. He's supposed to protect you. He's supposed to feed you and make sure that you're well, in other words. Okay, so there is a give and take, a symbiotic relationship between the patron and the client. In this case, they're both providing some form of service to each other. So again, they entered into this feudal system in Mozambique that was not necessarily based on kinship. Okay, so those were really, in very general terms, the dominant forms of social organization that existed in the pre-modern era. Those modes of social organization will undergo significant transformations, as we'll see, as we enter the modern age, with the rise, for example, of a commercial economy, capitalism, for example, and relationships will be based more on commercial transactions and wages, for example, something we're going to get to see. So this is important for you to understand the world as it was and how the world is going to start changing after the 1500s AD. Now, the last part, as I said, of this topic is going to deal with religious worldviews, the pre-modern religious worldviews. And this is also integral, an integral component of the pre-modern world. We cannot really understand pre-modern societies unless we look at their worldviews, how people understood the world around them. What was reality for them, for example? What is the meaning of life? What is the meaning of death? Where do we go when we die, for example? Is there an afterlife, and so on? What is the moral code that we should follow in order to live a peaceful and happy life, for instance? All of that is informed by religion. Okay, religion in the pre-modern world was key. It was actually fundamental to people's lives. This is a world before the era of modern science. So what that meant is that the way people are trying to come to terms with the world and trying to understand it is by formulating a series of religious beliefs and ideas that provided some form of meaning and comfort to their existence. So the civilizations that we have been looking at, like China, India, for example, the Middle East, Europe, Africa, Mesoamerica, were not just different in terms of their social organization and economic systems, but also those were civilizations that were very different because they really expressed different ways of looking at the universe. Okay, the people living in each one of those civilizations experienced reality very, very different from other cultures and civilizations around the world. So it is important to see how they perceive the world around them, the universe, reality, so we can have an understanding of how human societies came to terms with life and nature and the world and existence itself, and how those ideas will undergo radical change as we enter the modern age with the rise of modernity, the rise of modern science, the rise of materialism, the rise of consumerism, for example. All of that is going to clash again with the values, with the views of many of those societies. So, as I mentioned, religion was central to people's lives in the pre-modern world, in that it provided meaning. So it was really the basis of philosophy, for example. All questions about what is life, what is death, why do we die, where do we go after death, all of that, again, was answered by religion, something we're going to get to see in each of the religions or religious worldviews that we're going to be exploring here. It was also the basis of science. Whenever people wanted to understand how the world works, why does it rain, why there are natural catastrophes like earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and hurricanes, and so on. People use, more often than not, some form of religious explanation for that. That this was really the doings, the workings of spirits and gods or goddesses that were really moving the world, for example. Also time. People were very interested about time. What is time? They understood that time is real, of course. We can count that, we can measure it. But they were very also interested about time, how to compute time, and how to understand the different cycles of time. What we call astronomy, again, was part of also a religious understanding as well. Also, the world of politics was very much informed and based on religion as well. All of the political systems of the pre-modern era were sustained by religious claims and religious ideas. Rulers believed that they were given the right to rule by some divine force or divine order or entity of sorts. So the legitimacy of political institutions derived from the supernatural, from the spiritual world. And we're going to also get to see how in each one of those civilizations, rulers were claiming the right to rule based on some form of spiritual force or religious claim. All right, so we start with China. Okay, so the type of worldview that China developed over millennia was very distinct from all the other worldviews we're going to get to see. In fact, each one of the civilizations developed a very unique and very distinct worldview. In China, what we see is the development of a kind of naturalistic and social worldview, meaning that from their perspective, reality was the one that we experience in the world of nature. Okay? Nature itself, in other words, is reality. So they're very concerned with this world, the world of nature, but not in strictly materialistic terms. This is not a materialistic worldview, but rather it is a worldview in which they see the divinities living in nature as well. Again, this is what is called pantheism. Okay, pantheism is God in nature. So again, they're very much concerned with nature, but they also see that nature contains divine essences, in other words, that are responsible for the workings of nature. And it's also a social worldview because most of their ideologies and philosophies were concerned with how to organize human societies, how we can create the ideal social world as well. So once again, it's a very naturalistic and very social oriented worldview. Okay? Like I said, it's a pantheistic conception of the universe that sees nature as alive, it sees it animated, imbued with divine essences, and the way that nature works is that it goes through cycles. So again, cyclical time is very much ingrained in the consciousness of Chinese people, since antiquity all the way to the very present day. And this is something that comes from the experience of agriculture, meaning that with the rise of farming and agriculture in general, we see that people understood that the cycle of agriculture was connected to the cycles of nature as a whole, like the 4 seasons, for example. We have 4 seasons in a year, and those 4 seasons really explain the cycle of life. Okay, spring, summer, fall, and winter is really the cycle of life, the life of vegetation in this case. So they developed this idea that everything goes in cycles, not just agriculture, but also nature as a whole, that the human cultures have a cycle, that human beings are subject to cycles, that the lifespan of certain systems, whether those are natural systems or human-made, they're all subject to also the cycles of time as well. Okay, so they have this cyclical conception of time. So again, this idea that we're moving forward into a different kind of future is not really part of the experience in China, because everything is just repeating itself. Everything is just a wheel. It's a cycle that is constantly, coming and going, etc. Again, so keep that in mind, because with the rise of modernity, we're going to see a different experience, different interpretation of time as linear, as moving somewhere, that we're moving upward into a better future. In other words, that we are progressing in time, whereas in China and other civilizations that I will explain, this is, not really, the way nature works, because nature works in cycles. In other words, everything is just repeating itself. All right, so like I said, we see in China a series of different social philosophies that were devised by very wise people that lived before the Common Era, centuries before the birth of Christ, for example. In ancient China, we see, for example, individuals like Lao Tse, who around the 5th century BC devised a philosophical system known as Daoism. And this is, again, a system that is mystical, but also social at the same time. Mystical because in Taoism, the idea is that, the way nature and the universe works is that there is a certain energy that is flowing with a natural rhythm. That nature has a certain pace, a certain rhythm, a certain flow. We talk about the cycles, for example, the cycles of time. There's a certain flow, there's a certain rhythm. And that flow, that energy, he called it the Tao. And that we must be aligned with the Tao. We must be aligned with the rhythms, with the natural pace, with the energies of nature. We must work with nature, in other words, and align ourselves with nature in order to live in harmony and in peace. This is how we attain inner peace, inner tranquility, for example, mental stability, inner happiness, etc. The Tao. Now, he believed that the way to do this is by being in touch with nature. We must be in touch with the elements of nature, be with the rhythms of nature, and the ideal setting for this is in the countryside, not in the city. We must get away from the city, he said. We must get away from the urban centers because they're too noisy, they're too artificial, too convoluted, and we must move into the countryside to experience that inner peace. And who experiences this inner peace? The peasants, the peasantry. So for him, really, the peasantry represented the ideal in Chinese society. This is the ideal individual, the ideal human being who is in touch with the Tao. The peasant is living in nature. He is in tune with the rhythms, with the seasons. He's working with the elements of nature, with the flow of life. He's producing life, and they're feeding society. So what we see is that in Taoism, what we're going to see is a strong emphasis on the peasant as the hero. In other words, in Chinese civilization, the peasant was considered the hero of society. They're the ones producing the food, sustaining the civilization, and they are the ones actually in touch with the Tao, in other words. Okay, so we see that, very early on, this kind of worldview that elevates the peasant into this status of the culture hero. Now, after Taoism, we see another social philosophy, otherwise known as Confucianism. This is a philosophy devised by another wise man who lived more or less around the same time that Lao Tse was alive. His name was Confucius, or in the Chinese language, Confuci. And Confucius was not so much concerned about mystical, conceptions of the universe, but rather he really formulated a philosophy to create the ideal society, in China, the perfect society, the ideal society. And he believed that the ideal society was one that has a hierarchy, that a hierarchical society is the most consistent with the way nature works. And if you look at the universe, for example, the universe is a hierarchy. We see, for example, lower forms of life, like, for example, insects. We see after the insects higher forms of life, like animals, reptiles, for example, mammals, and human beings. And then human beings are part of this planet. And then beyond the planet, we see celestial bodies like the moon and the sun and the stars. So it seems that we are indeed in a kind of pyramid structure. So likewise, he said we should imitate the universe and form, a human society that clearly has groupings stacked one upon another in a hierarchical fashion from top to bottom, from the leaders on the very top all the way to the bottom, which are the masses, in other words. And he considered the leader of society the patriarch, the father figure of China. So he developed that idea that China was this big extended family, that it was a gigantic family, a network of lineages that were all connected through common ancestors. And the patriarch was the father figure of the family. So because the emperor is the patriarch of the family, he has a moral duty and responsibility to protect the people, to be benevolent, and to oversee the general welfare of all the masses, because they are all interrelated, and he is the patriarch, in other words. So this is a very kinship-based type of philosophy that he's formulating. He is also proposing that people should honor the emperor as a patriarch, should obey their betters, that the masses should obey not only the emperor, but also the imperial administrators. They should also obey those that are above the hierarchy, like their elders, their fathers, their mothers, their grandparents, their local landlord, the local patriarch in the region, and so on, because they're above in the hierarchy. Pay homage and respect to those above you to keep society stable and create the ideal society. And also to honor the ancestors, because the ancestors are also considered elders. Those people that came before us are also above the hierarchy, and we should continue paying homage to them as well. So he advocated for ancestor worship as a way to glue society together, to always refer to the past, to look to the ancestors as inspiration, as models for behavior as well. So again, this is a society that is very hierarchical. It honors the leaders, for example, as the patriarch, and looks at the past for inspiration and not necessarily to the future. They're not really looking at a different future, an ideal society, but rather the society that the ancestors established. Okay? Another concept that was developed in ancient China, outside of Lao Tse and Confucius, there were other philosophers that over time formulated another idea that was also central to the worldview of China, and that is an ideology that serves to legitimize the authority of the ruling dynasty. The ruling dynasty, who was controlling China, administering and governing the realm, according to this ideology, received the right to rule from heaven. Okay, the sky god, for example, that heaven or the sky god actually sent a blessing to the ruling family to rule the people. This was known as the mandate of heaven. Okay, so Chinese dynasties claim that their right to rule came from heaven. This is not really a particular God that they name, but this is very generic terms. It's just heaven, and that they had a mandate of heaven. That the mandate to rule, the right to rule, came from heaven, and that mandate of heaven will be there until the signs proved otherwise. In other words, the mandate of heaven was not eternal and perpetual. It could be taken away. And it could be taken away whenever the dynasty failed to fulfill its duty and responsibility to maintain the integrity of society and protect the people. So whenever there were, for example, catastrophes in the natural world, droughts, there were floodings, there was nomadic invasions from the outside, barbarians and so on, overrunning populations. Those were signs that the dynasty has lost the mandate of heaven, and it was now time for a new dynasty to claim power and oust that dynasty and remove that family altogether from power in order to bring about a new dynasty that will have the mandate of heaven to restore order, the balance in the world, in other words. So this is another very crucial ideology or philosophy of the Chinese worldview that was integral in the way the Chinese masses perceived the legitimacy of their political institutions. Again, is derived from the supernatural in this case. Okay. Another civilization that is also integral in understanding the pre-modern era was India. India also developed a worldview that was really a worldview that called for humans to move beyond, to transcend the physical world. So this is a transcendental worldview. And in India, we're going to see two major religions that were dominant, that were part of this Indian worldview, so to speak, this transcendental worldview. One was Hinduism, and the other one is Buddhism. So let's talk about Hinduism first. In Hinduism, the idea is that this whole world that we live in here, this physical world that feels so real and solid, is an illusion. Okay, this is called Maya. Maya is just the world of illusion. That the only thing that is really real is the universal spirit, the universal consciousness. And then they call it Brahman. Brahman is really the universal consciousness or universal spirit that is dreaming about the world. It creates the world of Maya or the world of illusion. And so we are here in this world as individual souls experiencing this illusion or Maya, and we're totally unaware that this is just a dream, in other words, of Brahman. We know that in reality, what we have to do is wake up from the dream and unite ourselves with Brahman, in other words. That life is part of a spiritual journey that takes us from lifetime to lifetime, and after a series of incarnations, we're going to realize the ultimate truth, which is Brahman, that we are one with the divine, in other words, which is Brahman. So we go through many incarnations. So the concept of reincarnation is central to Hinduism. And the way we're incarnating from lifetime to lifetime is that we are either accumulating knowledge or we're accumulating ignorance. And so that accumulation of knowledge and ignorance, in very general terms, is karma. Good karma is when you develop knowledge about how reality works, who you really are, and so on. You're positive, you treat others well, you're compassionate, for example, and the like. When you accumulate ignorance is when you separate yourselves from others, you hurt other people, and so on. So you are ignorant, in other words, of reality. You're hurting yourself by doing that, so you accumulate bad karma, and this is going to affect your incarnation. So every incarnation is the byproduct of previous actions or previous karmas, whether those were good karmas or bad karmas, for example. And the way we're supposed to, according to Hinduism, be evolving from lifetime to lifetime is through a social system, the caste system. According to Hinduism, those are the 4 stations of life that we have to be moving, from top to bottom. That human societies are organized in this fashion. At the very bottom are the Shudras or laborers, only followed by the producers, and then on top of them the warriors and the administrators, and on top the priest. And so we started out in the very beginning of our journey as laborers. The idea is that we have to incarnate there, be a good servant, serve other people, those above, the system, and so on. And that's our duty. That religious duty is called dharma. That in every caste, when we're incarnating in a caste, is because that's part of our dharma, our religious duty, and our karma as well. We must operate in that level until we're ready to move upward in a future incarnation. So if we obey all our rules, our dharma in that caste, in a future life, we will be rewarded, and we're going to be rewarded by being born into a higher caste. So we have to be accumulating good karma, behaving well within your caste. In other words, that's the idea. Until we reach the top of the ladder, we become priests in a future incarnation, and then we can be closer to the gods, and then realize the ultimate truth that we're all one, we're all Brahman, we're part of this universal spirit. Okay. Now, in Hinduism, again, this is not a single monolith religion. It is really a composite of many different religious cults and beliefs and practices. Hinduism is a composite of so many different traditions. Some of them are part of the little tradition, and others the big traditions. What is the little tradition? The little tradition are all the local cults of villagers and communities scattered across the sub-Indian subcontinent. There's a multiplicity, millions of gods. It is reported that by, for example, the 19th century, there were 330 million gods in Hinduism. The 19th century. So, again, this is something that goes back in time. The multiplicity, again, of deities and spirits that people pray to in Hinduism. And that's the little tradition. The big tradition are the major gods of the Hindu pantheon, the national gods. For example, Shiva and Vishnu. Okay, Shiva is the destroyer of ignorance. He destroys all ignorance, and this is something that people in South India worship. This is the most ancient god of India, going back to the Dravidian, population, the indigenous population. And Vishnu, he is the sustainer of the universe. He's the one that comes into the world and incarnates as the personification of God, like God on earth, for example. And this is the god of the Aryans. The Aryans brought Vishnu, and he's more prevalent in North India again. In Hinduism, we also have this concept of cyclical time. The Hindus also believe that we're going through cycles. They're called yugas or grand eras, and this is the way we are evolving spiritually through a system of cycles, in other words. So it's a cyclical concept of time as well. That is similar to the Chinese, although there are variations, of course. Buddhism is another religion that flourished in India around the 6th century BC. The founder was Siddhartha Gautama. He was a prince from Nepal, with present-day Nepal, from a kingdom there. And he attained enlightenment in that century after renouncing his princely title. So he was really the son of a king. He renounced the title, and he went out into the forest and the mountains to seek enlightenment, as you can see. And he became known as the Buddha. And the word Buddha means the awakened one. Again, that's what Buddha means, again, the awakened one. He's awake, in other words. Okay? Awake to the reality, again, that everything is one. That's what it means, again. Now, Buddha's teachings are centered on something called the Four Noble Truths. They're centered on this, again, psychological, almost understanding of life, in which, first and foremost, he says that life is suffering. Why do we suffer? Well, because that's part of life. If we're born into the world, that's inescapable. This part of our biological inheritance, in other words. But the cause of suffering is very, very specific, he said, and that is craving or desire. We suffer because we desire. We desire to have material experiences in this world, to satisfy certain emotional, physical needs, again, to urges, for example, of some sort. And that is the cause of suffering, because what happens when you're not able to satisfy that? We suffer, for example. So suffering comes from desire. In other words, think of the contrast with our present day civilization today that says otherwise. In our civilization, in our modern era, we tend to think that when you have a desire, we should satisfy it. We should give in to those desires, not to walk away from them or try to ignore them, but rather to try to gratify our desires. So again, see that as one of the contrasts we're going to be looking at. He also proposed that suffering ends with the cessation of desire. When desire ceases within ourselves, in other words, when we give up those desires, suffering ends. And the way to do this, last but not least, is through self-denial. To deny ourselves from the temptations, the cravings, the desires of this world, and to seek enlightenment. In other words, to seek inner knowledge. That's what enlightenment is. A life of meditation, contemplation, withdrawal from the world, and to go inwards, in other words. And we attain the state of nirvana. And this is, again, the state of knowledge, the state of unity, in other words, of knowledge. Okay. Now, he also advocated for nonviolence, which is ahimsa, nonviolence to all fellow human beings, also to animals as well. He also proposed the idea of universal equality, the idea that we're all equal, because we're all Brahman, we are all part of this universal consciousness and spirit. So therefore, this idea of caste, he rejected it. This idea that we're different because, you're born as a Shudra, a laborer, or you're born as a priest, so therefore, you are very different. No. He said that everybody at any time could realize the ultimate truth, whether you're a laborer, whether you are a warrior, a priest, anybody, in other words, okay? So it doesn't matter. So he went against the Hindu priesthood. In other words, he challenged them, and he tried to abolish the caste system, even though it was not abolished in India. So what we're going to be looking at here is that those teachings, those ideas of the Buddha after his death will spread like wildfire across India and even into the outside across Asia as a whole. And one of the critical figures that sponsored the spread of Buddhism across India was a king of the Mauryan Empire. His name was King Ashoka. In the year 273, he sponsored a series of missionary expeditions, sending Buddhist missionaries across India and also parts of Central Asia as well to spread that faith. He himself had converted to Buddhism due to the fact that he had a change of heart. He was a very cruel ruler, and after experiencing suffering and inflicting suffering to other people, for example, he converted to Buddhism, this faith of nonviolence and compassion. And after he did that, he made Buddhism the official religion of his empire and spread, again, the faith in every possible direction. Again, so the spread of Buddhism happened because of King Ashoka, and we're going to see that in later times, that faith, slowly but surely, even after Ashoka, that faith started spreading also into parts of China, for example. It went all the way to Japan and parts of Southeast Asia as well. Places like Thailand, for example, Cambodia, Laos, for example, Burma, Malaysia. All of that region, again, adopted the religion of Buddhism. And this is how that faith came to be the dominant worldview of most of Asian societies, over time. Okay. Now, another region I want to discuss here is Africa. And Africa, is very different from the worldviews that we have discussed so far. It has mainly what is called an animistic worldview. An animistic worldview. And what that is a worldview in which people see a multiplicity of spirits imbued in nature, and they develop a specific and special relationship with those spirits. In other words, this is really a spirit religion. And the region we're focusing here, most specifically here, is the religion of the Congo. The religion of the Congo, again, the Congo kingdom that we explored in previous sessions. Again, when we're looking at the Mani Congo, for example, and the social organization. Again, so this is a spirit religion. The spirits that they worship are, on one hand, nature spirits. They see that nature, again, has a multiplicity of different spirits. They live in the water, they live in the forest, they live in the mountains, and so on. and they develop a specific relationship with them, and they believe they could actually trap some of those nature spirits into objects. And this is what is called the kita. Okay, that is really an object that has a spellbound spirit from nature, and they use it for magical rituals and ceremonies of different sorts. Other spirits that are worshipped in the Congo in the pre-modern era, and perhaps they're more important, are the spirits of ancestors. They're called Bakula, for example. Okay, and the spirits of the ancestors are part of the tribal group. Okay, so the tribal group in Congo is composed of, on one hand, the living members of the group, but also the deceased members of the group. They're seen as a whole. In other words, there's no separation. You know, the ancestors that live in the other world, in the world of the spirits, they continue to exert an influence on the world of the living. They are guiding the living members of society. They are providing protection. They're providing luck, overseeing the family, providing counsel. Again, so it's very important for the religion of the Congo to maintain communication and relationship with ancestors. So ancestor worship is at the core of the Congo religion, ancestor worship, because again, they need the ancestors to keep the world going and to receive everything that they require to sustain their communities. And so how they maintain a link to the ancestors? Well, they create different types of ritual practices. For example, there's one in which they contain the essences of an ancestor onto an object. Those objects are called the kisi, for example, or nkisi. The nkisis, in the Europeans later on who arrived called them, fetish, for example. It's really a religious object made from wood and other materials, but it contains parts of the deceased ancestor, like nails and hair and so on. The belief was that you are bringing some essences of that ancestor into that object, and this is going to become like a link to the soul of that ancestor in the other side. You can use it to communicate with it, and every ritual you perform, to the fetish, so to speak, is going to affect, the soul also on the other side as well. So see it like a nexus point, a nexus link that connects to ancestors, for example. So again, this is central to their understanding of reality and why those rituals needed to be performed. Also, the Ganga is also very important in Congo religion, and he is the necromancer. He's an ordained, initiated priest who is able to communicate with the ancestors. Again, he is opening channels to the other world, talking to the spirit of the dead, and he's conducting all the ceremonies for positive ends, as opposed to using those rituals for nefarious, purposes like witchcraft and sorcery and black magic, for example. So he is like a medium. In other words, he's a channeler, and he receives communication. He communicates with the dead, as well. The other aspect of the Congo religion is spirit possession, in that, again, the people of the Congo also believe that part of the process of communicating with the ancestors is to be possessed by an ancestor. And they welcome that experience. In fact, this is the highest experience that anybody can have, is to be possessed by an ancestor spirit. This is what they're, after. And so there's also ceremonies for this. The priest must come in, prepare the person for a number of years for this experience. And once it's ready, there's a ceremony. There are drums, for example. There's a fire. There are dances, and the person will undergo the possession of the spirit, and the ancestor will speak to the community through the possessed. Okay, so this is very important, again, to provide counsel, to provide guidance, and so on, whenever the community was in crisis, for example. All right, so spirit possession is yet another aspect of the Kongo religion, and this is part again of this ancestor worship complex. Now, another civilization we must also discuss is Mesoamerica. Again, Mesoamerica has a worldview that is similar but not identical by any means to the one we discussed in Congo and also in China. There are certain overlaps. This is a worldview centered on something called nature mysticism. Now, this idea that nature is sacred. Okay. Nature is alive, nature is imbued with spiritual essences, and the gods of nature live in nature. The gods of nature don't live in another world. They don't live outside of this naturalistic world. They live here. Again, they are the ones in charge of rain, like the rain god, like the sun god, for example, the moon goddess, the earth goddess, for example, and so on. So again, this is a worldview, that actually looks at nature as sacred. So therefore, in Mesoamerica, whether we're talking about the Olmecs, the Mayas, for example, the Toltecs, later on the Aztecs, all of those cultures were nature worshippers. They worship nature. Okay. At the same time, they believe that there are certain individuals that can actually communicate with those natural forces. Okay, the gods and goddesses of nature. Those individuals are known as shamans. So shamanism is central to the Mesoamerican worldview. That there are individuals that can communicate with nature and they can bring about changes in the world of nature through ritual. So the shamans will, for example, control the weather. They will bring rain, for example, move the wind, and so on. And through ritual. So they have this idea of rituals as technology or ritual technology. If you want to make rain, you bring the rainmaker. If you want to control the wind, if you want to increase productivity in agriculture, fertilization in the forest or in a lake, in a river, you need a ritual to do that again. So this is important because, as we'll see, in the era of modern science and technology, everything will be done mechanically. You move nature through machinery and science, in other words, not necessarily ritual. In Mesoamerica, we also have this cyclical conception of time that time moves in a circle or in cycles. And in Mesoamerica, we see the creation of numerous, over 20 different cycles that map the movement of the sun, the movement of the moon, the movement of the planets, for example. And they charted each one of them and created a series of calendars in which everything is just moving in a cycle or in a circle. Okay, so for Mesoamericans, history is also prophecy, because everything that has happened in the past will happen in the future. So keep that in mind, because this is going to be important for how indigenous societies experience, for example, the coming of modernity, how they reacted, how they responded to it, and they're going to, in many cases, resist, of course, colonialism by predicting that the past will always come back. This ancestral past will reemerge in the future. The ancestors will come back. Our ancient cities will be restored and all of that. Again, it's a cyclical conception of time. Ancestor worship was also present in Mesoamerica, but it was used to legitimize the authority of the rulers for state rituals. The rulers will always perform a ritual in front of the community to tell the people that they were the heirs of the ancestors, that they were connected to all the kings that came before them, going all the way back to the very first gods, like the sun and the moon, for example, and the planet Venus. Okay, so ancestor worship is also present, but it takes a political character in Mesoamerica that this serves to legitimize power, in other words. Okay. Another region or civilization is Europe, and in Europe we're going to see in the pre-modern era the rise of Christianity. Now, Christianity, of course, is a worldview that emerges in the Middle East, in Mesopotamia, but it takes a unique character And this is a worldview that is going to come into Europe and become the dominant, worldview of Europe. It's a monotheistic and messianic worldview, meaning that this is a worldview centered on the idea of one God, and also the idea that this one God sends from time to time a representative, a Messiah, in other words. Okay, and that Messiah, that is really the forerunner of Christianity, was Jesus, of course, who lived at the beginning of the contemporary era. As you can see, and he comes from the tradition of Judaism and also the influence of Zoroastrianism, another religion of ancient Persia that gave us, for example, monotheism, the idea of one God, the idea of duality, the idea that there is opposing forces, good and evil, as well in the world, that there is, of course, an afterlife, a heaven and a hell as well. And the idea of end times, or the eschaton, that there will be a time of the end times when the world will come to an end, the world will be judged, the wolf will be separated from the sheep, and so on, and the creation of a new world and a new humanity as well. Okay, so again, it is all informed by these ancestral traditions of Judaism and Zoroastrianism. Now, the teachings of Jesus center on this idea of salvation, that we're here in order to attain salvation, to go to heaven, in other words, that there's a paradise, this eternal life, and the way to move into this afterlife is through a life of love and compassion, forgiveness, care for the poor, taking care of the oppressed, defending them, and so on, and also self-denial. Now, that we have to reject wealth and power, that those are trappings, that trap the soul in this world, and eventually leads to damnation, in other words, or punishment, in other words. There's also the idea of universal equality, just like Buddha. Jesus actually introduced the idea that we're all equal, that we're all sons and daughters of the same God, in other words, the single God, the monotheistic God, and so on. Again, so he also rejected, class differences and caste, etc. Even the oppression of women and slaves as well. He opposed that as well. Okay. Now, the person that was credited for spreading the teachings of Jesus was the Apostle Paul. He is, after Jesus, the person that takes Christianity into the Roman Empire. He's the founder of the very first Christian churches, and he's going to be key for the spread of Christianity into Europe. Okay, the Apostle Paul. But in the year 325, after a series of attempts to persecute the Christians, the Romans ended up converting to Christianity. The Roman Emperor Constantine the Great in 325 actually converts to Christianity. He's the first Roman emperor to convert to Christianity. And he establishes the first Christian church, the Catholic Church. He did this because most people were already converting to Christianity anyway, so he pretty much jumped ship, in other words, and he changed the faith, abandoned the old Roman gods, and adopted Christianity in order to save the empire. So he now creates the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church will be another institution that will spread far and wide the faith across Europe as well, sending missionaries, again, to convert the so-called pagan population of Europe. Another individual that is critical for the establishment of Christianity in the pre-modern era was St. Augustine in 426. He was the father of medieval Christian Europe when he established the idea that Europe and the world at large required creating the ideal kingdom of God, the ideal Christian community. He called it the city of God. In other words, that living within the confines of the Christian church was the ideal. To create, again, a perfect Christian community, a community of believers, in other words, that all will help each other attain salvation after death. So what we see is the emergence of a monastic society. Through his writings, he's going to be influential in the creation, again, of this monastic society in which the monastery was the most important institution of pre-modern Europe. People, in the monastery were secluding themselves from the world, contemplating, praying, and receiving also education as well. Again, it's a life of spirituality in Christian Europe, in other words. So St. Augustine is also critical in this regard in spreading this worldview. Last but not least, the Middle East. what we see is the flourishing of a new faith around the 7th century AD, and that is Islam. And Islam also comes from this background of Mesopotamia, just like Christianity. It shares the same principles of monotheism, duality, the afterlife, and the eschaton, but is more of a monotheistic worldview. It really stresses this idea of monotheism. And the person responsible for bringing about this faith was the Prophet Muhammad, who lived, in the 7th century AD. And he received a series of revelations again from the Archangel Gabriel, and were all written down in this compilation of writings, otherwise known as the Quran. Here he stresses the idea of monotheism. There's only one God, for example, and also the idea that civil law and religious law should be the same thing. Okay, this idea of Sharia law, for example, that the way that human societies should be organized here in this world is according to religious law. So the Quran also establishes a moral code for human behavior, for social relationships, for even economic transactions. Again, that everything should be informed through the Quran. In other words, the entire society, even the political system. He even suggested the creation of a social political Islamic community, just like Saint Augustine is trying to create a city of God. Well, Muhammad also has his own version of that. He called it the Ummah, and that is the socio-political Islamic community. And indeed, we're going to see the creation of such communities, otherwise known as the caliphates, for example. And the caliphates will be the centers of Islamic empires. We can see the spread of Islam from 632 to 1258 across the Middle East, and even parts of North Africa as well, and even parts of Western Europe, as a matter of fact. The very first caliphate was governed by Muhammad and the family of Muhammad, briefly from 632 to 661. And we see a massive territorial expansion during this very first caliphate, centered in Mecca and Medina. Again, you can see in this map the expansion of Islam in different times, the different caliphates, for example. And again, they're converting populations as they're moving across the region. And it is really at the end of this caliphate where we see the divisions of the Muslims between two groups, the Sunnis and the Shiites. With the death of Muhammad and the end of the very first caliphate, the Muslims separate between those that prefer to have a caliphate governed by ordinary people, just political figures that will be in charge of the community, and the others are the Shiites, who prefer that religious figures connected to the Prophet Muhammad, the family members, relatives, be the ones in charge. So we see the division of the Muslim world between those two people, again, the politicians, so to speak, and the priests, in other words. And at first, the politicians, so to speak, win out when they create a caliphate called the Umayyad Caliphate. It was a dynasty, from Syria, and they established the capital in Damascus, and they run a caliphate, that also expanded pretty much the Islamic empire across vast regions, again, of North Africa, including the Iberian Peninsula in Europe as well. So again, this is going to be a massive expansion, and it becomes really the very first imperial system of Islam, the Umayyad Caliphate. But remember, they're Sunnis, so therefore they're not really run by priests. Here, the Umayyads use the ulema, as they were called, which are religious scholars, to administer the empire. They're not priests, in other words. They're just religious scholars. But the most significant part of this process is that Islam is spreading across, vast distances, and Arabic is also becoming the universal language of the caliphates as well. We also see the Abbasid coming afterwards. It's a different, group that takes over in 750 and moves the capital to Baghdad. They're Shiites, so this is a more religious-based, theocratic, administration of the empire, and it spanned all the way to 1258 AD. As you can see, it was ruled from Baghdad. And the significance, again, of this caliphate is that here we finally see a true cultural unity in the Islamic world, a common culture, a common cultural universe with a standard of customs, manners, and laws. It becomes very unified, in other words, culturally during the Abbasid Caliphate. Because they're Shiites, Islam now becomes the force for political legitimacy. No, the legitimacy of the rulers in this case comes from Islam. Again, because they claim connections back to Muhammad, in other words. So Islam, the religion, is now central to the legitimacy of the rulers. The establishment of religious orthodoxy is central to them, which means that now people must be governed by Sharia law, civil law, marriage, criminal law, economics, everything. Every aspect of life must be governed by the Quran, in other words, during the Abbasid Caliphate. And in order to ordain new priests who are going to administer the empire, there's the creation of colleges for religious education. Religious education is central, in other words, now in the Islamic world to produce the new priests, the new administrators, and also to create an Islamic society through and through, in other words. Okay, so you receive a religious education. That is the kind of education, again, that is available at this time. So what we have now covered so far in the last 3 sessions of this very first topic, the many worlds of the pre-modern era, is that first and foremost, when we look at economic systems, we looked at agriculture as the basis of all the economic systems of the world. Okay, all the civilizations we covered, China, India, for example, even Africa, Europe, and the American continent, the Western Hemisphere, it was really agriculture. The way that people were sustaining their communities, their towns, their cities, and also their empires as well. We see these distinct systems of irrigation. They vary from civilization to civilization. Some of them took engineering works, hydraulic systems, irrigation, canals, dikes, and dams, for example, in China. There were those that were more naturally occurring, like the ones, for example, in Egypt, with the ebb and flow of the Nile, for instance. And we also see very innovations, for example, in Europe with the aqueducts of the Romans, for example, as well. Those were marvels of engineer, and also those that were devised by the Mayas and the Aztecs, for example. We looked at the slash and burn, and we also look at the Chinampas as well. What is very significant, again, from those economic systems is that they were all, without exception, systems that were based on tribute. In other words, how the states administer the finances, the expenses of the bureaucracy, for example, the armies and so on, is by extracting tribute from the peasantry. So peasant tribute was really the wealth of all state systems in the pre-modern world. Okay, peasant tribute. The crops, the food products that you extract from peasants is really what sustained, again, the state and also the armies as well to wage war. We also see the human impact of the environment. We looked at that, how, in some situations, there was an impact of the environment, like the extraction of nutrients, nitrogen from the soil that rendered the land barren, but also the collapse of civilizations as a result of the massive decimation of forests, like in the Maya world that led to the Maya collapse in the year 900. So, although there's very little impact that humans are having on the environment is still a very powerful force in human societies. Human societies are beginning to exert some influence on the environment as well. Now, in terms of social organization, we see 2 different types, kinship and clientage. We cover that quite thoroughly in session 2 and part of this session as well. That it was the norm in the pre-modern world to organize around families or family networks, or societies based on feudalism, clientage, paying tribute to a lord to receive protection. You were not part of an extended family, but rather just a client, in other words. Europe and Africa were case studies of that. And last but not least, that religion was central also in the pre-modern era. It was the basis of how people constructed reality. It was also the source of their identity, whether it was personal identity or their social identity. It also serves to legitimize, for example, class divisions, why some people had to be part of a certain group or caste, for example, as well. And also, it served to legitimize power, political authority. It was really the basis of society as a whole, of every aspect of society, including science. How people were trying to understand the world also was very much informed by religion. Okay, so this is all I have for you. When we come back, in the next topic, we're going to be exploring the very first events that are beginning to bring about the early modern period. Those events are going to really change in very important ways everything we have been discussing: the economic systems, the social organization, and the religious worldviews. Everything will be explained to you at the beginning of the next topic when we come back. This is all I have for you, and I'll see you then in the next topic coming next.